Kia ora, over to you, Fee.
Lovely, thanks, Bex. Kia ora, everyone. Lovely to see you all, and thank you for joining us with our Future of Education 2022 and beyond. So we're just going to kick off with a karakia to bring you all into our space for this evening. Bear with me one moment. Ko te kawa o runga, ko te kawa o raro, ko te kawa ora, ko te kawa oro. I rongo e whakairihia ki runga turaturo o whiti whakamaua kia tina, huie, pai kia. Now, just a quick agenda before we start to do our introductions. We are obviously in this incredible space. Lovely to see all your faces, and we're here to talk about the future of education, which our founder and CEO, Frances Valintine, is going to be taking us through all her research and insights this afternoon. We then have an opportunity at about 5 o'clock to have Q&A from the audience. I have had the privilege of sitting through a number of these over my time, and one of the key things is making sure that we allow people to ask those very important questions from Frances. And then we will aim to wrap up at 5:30. Thank you for being generous with your time. We will certainly try and keep right on that 5:30 so that you can go and have your evenings with your loved ones and your whānau. So I'm Fee Webby. I'm the General Manager here at the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab. I've been on this incredible journey with Frances and our amazing team here for the past 7 years. I'm actually from the Wairarapa, a little town called Martinborough, on the sunny side of the Rumatakas, just across the way from Wellington. And my background has been in the digital space and the technology space, agency side, and then 7 years ago I came over to join Frances on this incredible journey of transforming education in Aotearoa. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Frances to everybody. For those of you that may not know Frances, she is a technologist and an educator, and she's dedicated her time and her life to education. She's been focused on the future of work and the development of human capability for the duration of her career. She's our founder of the Mind Lab and, of course, Tech Futures Lab as well. These are organisations that she's created to provide learning pathways for educators and professionals, not just to participate in, but to have sustainable impact for technology-driven futures. So, without further ado, apologies, we also have some other people from the Mind Lab here who may pop up. And our first one is Lisa Whittington-Slater. So Lisa is our outreach manager, an incredibly passionate human being, very empathetic, who is all about supporting our students in whatever shape they come into the Mind Lab, and really understanding what it is that might be your drivers or your challenges, and to articulate what programs might suit you. And then we have our incredible marketing team here. So we also have Bex Taylor and Jane Apprentice, who are very much behind the scenes, but are the ones who drive everything that we do with our events and our incredible marketing. So it's always a massive shout out to them, because they make these sorts of evenings happen. So thank you. Now, we are going to record this session tonight. You may have seen a little pop-up that's already come up on your screen to let you know that we are recording. We would ask that you just keep yourself on mute until we get into that Q&A at the end. There's often things that are going on behind people, so it'd be fantastic if you can just mute, and then everyone gets that opportunity to hear what Frances is saying. So that would be fabulous. And of course, we'll send this presentation out on email tomorrow. So a little bit about the Mind Lab. We are dedicated to postgraduate studies. So typically our students are about 44 years of age across both the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab. And we're all about creating capability, about getting skills and knowledge and confidence into whoever it is that comes through our doors, and making sure that as New Zealanders and within Aotearoa that we can lead change. Now, we know that change is challenging, so we're here to support you on that journey. Our teaching and learning is grounded in our kaupapa Māori values. So we have a teaching and learning strategy that is all around te ara kotahi, where we put the student at the centre of everything we do to support you in your learning journey to reach your kotahi, your summit. And so we want to make sure that all of our learning is accessible and of course valuable and contextualised to what it is that you're doing within your practice. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Frances, and she is going to take us through her insights around the future of education. Over to you, Frances.
Kia ora Fi and tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for joining me today. And there's lots of familiar faces and I see a few friends from offshore. That's always great to see them. The session I'm going to be running tonight is really focused on Aotearoa. And so if you are from overseas, I'm sure you have plenty of takeaways that still relate to the work you're doing. I know many of you are passionate educators, some of you are parents, some of you are working within the education, the broader sense in higher education. So hopefully all of tonight's session will give you some insight to what's going on. The information comes from very valuable sources. A lot of it comes from our own ministries, data that's been gathered all the time, some of the trends and insights, but also signals of change, things that perhaps you haven't thought about. And so please do take notes of any questions you have, otherwise post them into the chat, and then allow half an hour at the end after 5 o'clock to answer as many of the questions as they possibly can. But given we have a lot to get through, I'm going to share my screen and get into the presentation. So actually, I thought this image was really interesting. It's the Creative Commons image, but I did laugh on the image on the back of the wall. I thought it was very typical of the time we live in, which is, it's a funny old world. And I think it's very apt to say right now that in education, we have to laugh because actually there is so much pressure on how many things are actually changing right beneath our feet in whichever part of the sector that you might be interfacing with. But I really want to start off talking about why are we here? Why is it important to look into the future of education? And actually, what are the signals that we're seeing right now that we need to be mindful of? Because some of them are fairly stark and are really indicating some of the challenges ahead. The first one here, courtesy of Dr. Nina Hood at the Education Hub here in Aotearoa, is actually looking at the achievement levels of Year 8 students. And if you look here, you'll see the dark line is the students who are falling below the curriculum level across these core subjects. So in some areas like in science, you'll see 80% of students are not achieving the curriculum level. In areas like writing, social studies, and even in PE and physical education. And so these are really challenging times because not only are we seeing some of the declines across metrics like PISA, we're seeing them within our own country, but we're also up against some of the challenges of remote learning over the last couple of years, trying to get back into schools when we've also got the ongoing impact of COVID and the flu in the winter season, and then general absenteeism, which is affecting schools right across the country at all levels. And so this is a good reason to be interested, even if you're coming at this as a parent, to understand that we have got these challenges about actual outcomes and achievement. The New Zealand Initiative put this report out actually pre-COVID, because a lot of people are talking about absenteeism as though it's just a COVID-related issue. This was actually in February 2020, deliberately chose this one because it was just before COVID. And even then it said that only 58% of students were attending class 90% of the time. And so there was a large drop off. And you see in the second paragraph here from this report, that attendance rates have been dropping since 2015. And then if you look at the attendance at intermediate schools, for those at years 7 and 8, has dropped just under 74% in 2015. And in 2020, it was just 60%. So this challenge of absenteeism has been on the rise for quite some time, so for at least the last 7 years. But we do know now in the headlines and in the media, we're seeing a fundamentally focused on that 60% are attending, and there's a 40% of those who are not attending regularly. So it's good to understand what that means and what's behind it. And so the Ministry of Education does put out data on a regular basis. This is from the week, you'll see at the top there, of the 4th of July to the 8th of July, so just quite recently. And what I think is really interesting to note here, it's not so much a decile issue. And for those who don't understand decile, there's an index within New Zealand where we have we rate people where they live based upon social deprivation and social kind of makeup of the community. These have been phased out, which I'm thrilled about, but at the moment they still exist in this concept. And so you'll see here that there isn't a huge variance between decile 1 being the lower decile schools and the decile 10 schools. So it is a theme, and you'll see another very distinguished theme, which is the Friday drop is more profound. I think what's interesting, that probably aligns to a lot of people in the workforce, where you see with remote working that Friday is probably the least attended day in the office as well, as people look to having that sort of that 3-day weekend, even though they may be working through. Just another slice and dice of the same data by ethnicity. And so you'll see here on the left the European and the Pakeha students versus across the Māori, Pacific and Asian cohorts. Again, not huge variations between them. And you'll see the same trends across the days of the week. But we do need to keep an eye on this, because it's causing learning gaps. And I know there's a lot of pressure on right now, particularly with school principals and communities and boards of trustees, to try to understand how to bring students back. And there are, of course, many students who are nomadic by their lifestyle because of their parents' type of work. But also right now, people are returning to their families offshore. They haven't seen them for a couple of years. There's people who have connections back into other parts of the world are traveling, which also means often children out of the school environment. This report, commissioned or written by Peter Gluckman, and so Peter Gluckman works in some really amazing areas of thinking about change. And this is specifically around Tamaki Makaurau, or Auckland City. So for the 1.7 or 1.8 million people who live here, but actually his point is relevant for the whole country, that the education trap is disadvantaged as a poverty trap. So poverty and education, often the two things coexist. And New Zealand has this terrible rating here of being one of the most unequal education systems in the developed world, just 33rd out of 38 OECD countries. And so we have increased inequality, but we also are leaving more students behind. And unfortunately, with Māori Pacific populations, they do get affected more if education doesn't come in at the right stage and doesn't enable students to lift themselves and be involved with education and to be successful. Then actually it becomes sort of compounded, and the issue continues. Some of the big trends, and this is going to be of no surprise to anyone in education, or in fact anybody who's been around for the last couple of years, online learning as a whole has increased dramatically. This is New Zealand data. So we're seeing significant, you'll see here, there's a projected data. So around this 2022, a big lift since COVID, and we moved online, and more students of all shapes and forms and ages and stages are moving online. And this trajectory is expected to grow significantly. And I will talk quite a lot more about online activity through this presentation. This is really just a very high level kind of graph. Oops. Not sure that. Apologies, I'm just going to just pop out to move that back in again. So one of the other big changes is the rise of micro-credentials. Now, many of you may have heard of these as badges or nano degrees or other forms, but the online degrees and micro-credentials, particularly as in the tertiary or the higher education market, are really lifting very, very fast. And so you'll see two key lines here. The red line is pre-COVID, so that was a forecast of the lift they expected over time. The blue line is the actual, how we're seeing it playing out, and the lift across. The number of people who are moving to online is their primary way to become educated. Now, this is across this particular graph is talking about the higher education market, and you'll see there they talk at the beginning on the left-hand box about the very strong online degree market pre-COVID. So the OPM, the operational performance measure that universities often deploy, they're starting to look at this MOOC model. Now, MOOC is the MOOC acronym there, which is the massive online open courses. And so more institutes are seeing that there is this operational performance that comes from online, that you actually can reach more people more cost effectively, and you can be more flexible about the types of learning. So this trend is absolutely playing out around the world, and certainly one that we have been seeing here within the MindLab and Tech Futures Lab. Why do people go into micro-credentials, and what's the interest? So if you are in the higher education or tertiary education market, the number one is provides better access. And access is one of the big, the most jarring data points around inequality. So the great thing about online and micro-credentials is more people can actually participate. Some people are doing it because of workplace need or needing to have the qualifications to be able to do their job, addressing skill gaps, etc. Now, for us here, when we are teaching adults, at postgraduate level, we see this, really important, that a lot of people mid-career are really investing their time and energy now into learning so that they can bridge the gap between what they know and some of the new technologies or the workplace practices, or thinking about things like distributed working teams and organizational agility, all the things that are starting to play out now in the workplace. So micro-credentials are a big part of this, but we see that the big one still is access is number one, or workplace need. And I should just show you a couple of ways this is playing out within Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is a new website that hasn't officially gone live, but it is live, and one that we were involved with developing for Education New Zealand, and I was thrilled to see some Education New Zealand people on this call. So missionnewzealand.com is a platform that takes New Zealand programs to the world. And you'll see here just this mini example here. We have a range of institutes here. I want to call out to Otago Polytechnic for their sustainability and their biculturalism short course. We've got Media Design School Adopting Agile, and a bunch from us here on this image. And these are a range of free and paid courses. And it's really about saying, how do we attract people into learning so that they can actually feel like, what does this new online education look like? And it's pushing all of us to be very clever in the way that we think about cohorts and collaboration and how we facilitate creativity and innovation in an online space. And so there's a lot of separation happening right now between the very good and the very poor in terms of online engagement. A lot of it comes down to having live interface with individuals, but also having some really great content that's very rich in video and audio, high production values. So we can't get away with just doing things cheaply anymore if we're going to move more into this space. And so another great example, again, with Education New Zealand, have partnered with FutureLearn, a platform that came out of the Open University in the UK and SEEK in Australia, has 16 million students on it. And here's some examples how some of our institutes around the country are attracting students through online. So these are short little 6-week course, example here from the University of Canterbury, a couple of hours a week, $14 to participate in this course. And so this is really sort of seeing the democratization of education. So we're starting to see this idea that organizations here, and this is another good example from Tipu Kinga, where you've got a skills for higher learning, actually taking on these online MOOC platforms, these massive online open course platforms, the likes of Udacity, Coursera, there's many of them, LinkedIn Learning, and providing intros to learning, almost like tasters, but also a lot of people using these short courses as their core way of upskilling at a low or a no cost model. And then just one more example here, which is actually from Te Papa, the museum. And so actually having a non-traditional educator coming in on this platform and showing that how during that they adapted their museum experiences so that people could understand what education could look like in a physical space like a museum. And so we really should start looking at what other New Zealand providers are doing alongside international. Here I want to just do a quick call out for a Kiwi company called Kara Technologies. And this is a great example where we have here in the foreground a sign language expert reading the story I think most of us know, the hungry caterpillar. And you'll see here how you're using an avatar, so AI-based for sign language.
One Sunday morning, the warm sun came up and
what's really lovely about this is now you have this technology where you've got digital humans who are really convincing, but able to fulfill a job that perhaps would be too expensive to do with education. So this type of technology is really starting to dominate across the world, where we've got avatars presenting so that it could be specialists and they can actually teach in a sort of a perfect mode at all times. But then at the other end of the spectrum, here's another example that we're involved in here with the Mind Lab, and many of you hopefully have used Digital Boost. It's a free online learning platform for business owners who want to learn to digitize their business. And this platform, we have 50,000 people using it, learning on it around digitization. And these are all video-based. And so here you see, again, another government agency with MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, seeing that education can come in multiple different formats. And so more like a Netflix experience or a Spotify experience and less like traditional learning. So a great example of how learning online is starting to diversify into these much more interactive, but also bespoke and highly personalized environments, which really utilize data. And so if you're in education, the one thing we have is plenty of data. It's just what we do with it and how we bring it all together to make use of it so that we can personalize learning experiences. So the OECD has come out recently with this report, What Schools for Tomorrow, the Future Thinking and Leading for Uncertainty. And this is the 4 scenarios that they talk about for this future of schooling. And I'll just go through them because I think they're all quite interesting. They're not saying they know which one of these will play out over the next few years or few decades, but let's go through them. The first is that schooling is actually extended. This is more like a traditional schooling. So participation in formal education continues to expand. There's more international collaboration and more technology advances and more individualized learning. But basically, schooling looks and feels similar to what it is today. That's the only one of the 4 that assumes that there's going to be some sort of familiarity to today's schooling. The second one is traditional schooling starts to break down as society becomes more involved with educating their citizens. So sort of the community approach, teaching your own, actually learning takes place through much more diverse, privatized and flexible arrangements. And I think that the point here around digital technology is a key driver. And I think this is where online learning mixed in with face-to-face learning, with community learning, that actually much more pick and mix. So this is sort of like an outsourced distributed education model. The third is schools are learning hubs. And so the schools do remain, but they actually, they are much more around getting people together to do experimental, collaborative, innovative type activities. So it's not just sitting in a classroom listening to a teacher, it's actually you're going there for a reason. A little bit more like the workplace today, where people come into the office are far more likely to come in if there's things to do where you're actually brainstorming together, working together, and it's less about just coming in and sitting at your cubicle or your desk working in isolation, which you could do at home. So this is about opening the school walls and connecting the school much more to communities. And I think this will have a fantastic place potentially within Aotearoa as we connect into our diverse communities and making sure education is relevant for all. And then the last one is probably the most radical, which is learn as you go, that education takes place everywhere all the time. And there's really the distinction between formal and informal learning are actually no longer valid. So basically we stop thinking about measurement assessments in the current way. We start to think about people self-learning, self-education, people kind of work and learn as they need and apply it within their job or what they do within the community. So these 4, well, they're all quite radical. It is really an indicator of what the OECD and others are thinking about in terms of where schooling is heading. And there's many of these levers are starting to take place right now. We're starting to see the beginning of why these could start to morph from what we have. Another really good report from the Centre for Strategic Education that came out recently about renegotiating learning in a hybrid world. This particular quote, I think we can all relate to, that COVID-19 pandemic showed up our traditional school systems, assessment practices and metrics of success is woefully inadequate for today's dynamic, changing world or challenging world. This presented the much needed case for change for so many schools, systems and leaders provide an opportunity to test new ways of doing formal education for all. I think it's fair to say that right now it's the best time we could possibly imagine to trial new things, because right now the catalyst of change has happened already. The circuit breaker has taken place. And so organisations like the Centre for Strategic Education are saying if we don't use this part of adversity that we've experienced to actually facilitate changing conversations, we've missed an opportunity. And certainly I'm a great believer of that. But let's just have a little look at demographics, because we can't go too far without understanding how far we have moved in the last few years. And for those who've been to my sessions before, I talk about demographics a lot, and certainly how quickly the world population is growing. And it has already doubled in my lifetime. It will certainly increase significantly and get close to at least 10 billion people before I leave this planet. And so if we think about that, right now, 61% of the world's population is actually 39 or younger. but actually more astoundingly is 33% are under 20 years old. So 2.6 billion people. And this group of people are very, very digital. They've grown up digital, regardless of where they live, because almost everyone in the world now has access to a mobile phone. Many have more than one mobile phone. And actually, the internet connectivity in most parts of the world now, the penetration rate is well over 90%. In fact, it's closer to 95% of the world's population has reliable internet. And so the shift has happened already. So we talk a lot about the aging population because actually the biggest growth change is the number of people who are living now beyond 75 and older. And so most people assumed, particularly in earlier years and decades, that you got to 75, you had a good innings, that was a good life. Now we all assume we're going to be much older than that. So we do have a very, very large aging population, but we also have a very young population. And to show the difference, I've just picked out two countries here from our world on data. So on the left, the population distribution of Japan, and on the right from Nigeria. And you'll see here, first of all, Japan's population has grown from sort of like 82, maybe 85 million to now has been well over 120 million. Nigeria started with maybe around 45 million and now is well over 200 million. So much, much more rapid growth. But you'll see here on the Nigerian how few people are 65 years and older. It's a very young population. A vast amount of people, if you look at those two, the pink and the purple, and even the green, you're talking about 120 million people in one country under the age of 24. So the vast majority by a million miles. And see, on the other hand, you have Japan, where they didn't have immigration as part of their core country strategy. So it was pretty much a closed market. And now they have a very much an aging population who are living much longer than we ever imagined, but a very small tax base. And so the education model was having to be thought about too. And so there's all sorts of models right now. Some of them, in many countries, they're doing things like social credits, where young people work with older people to teach them, to work with them, to support them, and earn credits that you'll be able to basically cash in when you yourself become retired. And there's multiple different models of this around the world, and certainly in Japan. So this is important to understand. So when we talk about countries, we do need to understand the demographics, because that impacts massively on the priorities around education and what we're doing. If we come back to Aotearoa and we look at our across New Zealand for the distribution and our population, so this just 18 years time, we'll have raised from 5 to 6 million people. I suspect actually personally it'll be much higher than that, given the desirability if our inflation rates come down. But also that number of people over 65 is really going to grow dramatically. It's going to double to that 1.4 million. So the retirement age will be questionable, I suspect, at that point when we're trying to support from a pension point of view. But the median age already for Māori is going to be much younger at 28 years compared to 42 years old for Pakeha. But overall, 52% of the population of the country will be non-Pakeha, which is really fundamentally going to change the way that we operate. And it certainly changes our priorities for education, making sure that everyone has a fair and equitable experience and the ability to do very well in our education system. We've touched on it, but I'll just quickly catch this again around the age increases. So for every decade, the average age life expectancy in the world increases by 3 years. This is pretty much across all parts of the world now. So based upon their baseline, so if you were in a developing country, the same thing is happening. It's just that the Finnish age is still a bit lower, but they're all normalising. So within New Zealand now, that half the children in our school system, particularly primary school, should and will expect to live to be over 100 years. And you'll see on the table on the left, so if you're born in 2010, the chances your life expectancy on average will be 93, nearly 96 if you were born in 2018. And that's just going to keep continuing. And so we have to plan for a life that typically goes to the century. So we talked before about the AI specialist when you have somebody who is doing sign language, which obviously adds a great dimension to learning. Here's another example of an avatar and how far this technology has gone in terms of AI.
How's it going? I'm here to talk to you about education, the type of education that might take some time to get your head around. My world and my aspirations are seen through my eyes as I plan for my future. So let's have a look.
So we're really seeing great advances, and these are, almost so human. It's perhaps the voice is the only thing that gives them away. And so these are not based upon real people, but they're actually based upon an AI imagination of a created person. And you'll see a lot of this technology, unfortunately, good use for good and bad. Deep fakes are often used in the same way. So Gen Z. So this is a group between the ages of 10 and really sort of 25, 26 now. And they are in the workforce in increasing numbers. They are certainly right through an entire school system and university system. But their world is fundamentally online. And for the majority of them, they spend around 8 to 10 hours a day connected to the internet actively, whether it be on social media or in other forms of communication. And what they do is they're creating these worlds where they're virtual, they sit within this metaverse, they have their own avatars, they're actually stylizing the way they look. And you'll see in the top left-hand corner here, the types of things they'll be thinking about, what they're wearing, the brands, the shoes. You can put your own digital avatar, Nike boots on your feet for, the small fee of $200 or $300. These environments are the place that they feel really comfortable hanging out and kind of creating the space where their friends would come and join them. So in this environment here, you've only got the one person, but in a true metaverse environment, they would be hanging out with their mates. And so this area of the metaverse is really starting to shape how education is looking. The images on the left, these are education environments that already exist, and increasingly I'm seeing universities around the world, particularly those who have some really strong R&D and research outputs, are really experimenting with this idea. Instead of sitting on a Zoom call like we are right now, that actually you would go and create your avatar, join your colleagues and your students and your cohort, and actually you would interact around a table and feel like you were sitting at the table. These will be used with various AR, VR goggles or glasses, and there's a lot of debate right now which ones are going to dominate the market. There's certainly more and more companies playing in this space. But when you go into the space, you start to understand Web 3.0. And I don't want to get too far into technology on this particular talk. I have another talk I do on a quarterly basis around strategic insights around technology. But this one, just to give you an idea, if these are not familiar to you, these are sort of things that your young students will be thinking about. Things like new payment networks, decentralized everything, not just finance, decentralized systems, NFTs, the non-fungible tokens for payments, decentralized governance, the decentralized cloud, and then this whole thing around self-sovereignty and identity. And so their terminology and what they're focusing on is really quite new for anybody who's not in this audience, who are in this age group. And so you have to be very closely aligned to what they're doing to understand how it's going to play out. Because if you start to look at this group of young people of Generation Z, there is 900,000 new people joining social media in that group every single day. So not per year, every single day. Nearly 1 million people a year joining social media. So they're connecting in a way that we could never imagine. The other thing about Generation Z who are in your school system right now, regardless of where you are, unless you're teaching littlies at primary school, they are very big on social impact. And so the things that drive them, the careers they want to do, the types of study are very different. So they want to have social impact. They want really supportive work environments. They want to have fun and diversity in the environment, inclusion. They want open-minded leaders. They want people who really understand their point of view and listen. They have a view that 72% of them will find it challenging to work with people from different generation, particularly around baby boomers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. 54% of them would prefer a millennial manager. And so the millennials are the group just a little bit older than this, and millennials are between the age of 26 to 41 years old. And so for a long time, millennials, I think we all thought of them as being sort of 25. Now they're up into that 40 group, and they are the biggest at the moment in the workforce. There are more millennials than any other grouping. So the chances are that they will have a millennial manager, given the odds of the distribution of age groups. So if you took this group of young Gen Z and said, what type of industries would they go into? Here's a great example for Oculus, one of the companies who play in this space. And you'll see here they're advertising for a gameplay engineering manager. A manager would, probably somewhere between 25 and 30 in this case. And what they want here is, they've got in here, the ideal candidate is experienced software engineer manager with a building background and consumer experiences of two-sided marketplace of consumers and performers that include sharing and social features and excitement at the notion of delivering a value in the new space of VR. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, then when you get into the next one, they'll be thinking about find themselves energetically imagining new ways to experience concerts, expos, conventions, conjure new opportunities to leverage valuable points of intent from the Facebook family. So you'll find that this type of roles will feel very foreign. And actually, if you go onto local job platforms right now, if you go onto Trade Me or Seek or equivalents, you'll find these roles and you'll see increasingly they're talking about these interactive virtual experiences and wanting young people to come into these jobs knowing things like Unity 3D or Unreal. And so this is just one indicator of many jobs that you could see online right now. And these two groups here, Gen Z and millennials, I've talked about the pink being Gen Z, are the types of things that they are dominant in. So they're much more likely to have created avatars for video games or hung out virtually in a video game. This might be like an esports. They would have created an avatar on social media to represent themselves. They've had experience with virtual reality headsets. They've purchased virtual goods. They follow virtual people. So these are non-real people on social media and they follow them. But also the only exception here where millennials are more dominant than the Gen Zers are those who have actually purchased cryptocurrency or NFTs. So everything else, you'll start to see the shift is already happening between these two age groups. And when you think about these virtual experiences, which in the future will include education, the group here of the purple are people who know the metaverse, which almost every young person does. You'll see there's a really high likelihood that they'd be comfortable and interested in attending a virtual event, including digital concerts, digital movies. And when I say a digital movie, I don't mean a digital movie like a Netflix. I mean actually going into a virtual shared space and watching like a drive-through, almost hanging out together and watching it within the metaverse. And so you'll see all these things, digital plays and musicals and even cocktail parties. So when we start to see the social attributes and interests of this group, you'll start to understand why education starts to feel like it's very stayed as it was and hasn't moved. I won't go through all of this, but just in terms of the same type of the trends that are happening across virtual worlds, right through things like esports and gaming and global crypto, this group, the biggest users of all of these are these Gen Zers and young millennials. So the 20s and 30-year-olds. I just wanted this quote. Recently, I was in a session with a bunch of students, so just this local student here in Tamaki Makaurau, and I thought I'd just read this one to you. So the conversation, I had to write it down, was DeFi and the DAO model is the best platform that offers the best compatibility and interoperability with Ethereum. Most of the cryptocurrencies I deal with are based in Ethereum through EVM compatibility or ERC token. Last year, layer 2 plays such as Polygon were very popular. Now, if you don't understand that, it's fair and reasonable, but actually this is the type of language we're talking about. We're talking about a language of change that's happening so rapidly that we're actually not necessarily understanding any part of it. And you'll see there I have done a little bit of a sort of a description about what these different terminologies actually mean. And so when we start to see students who can talk like this about a language that is not at all familiar or shared within the education environment, it's actually, for me, it's our job to understand what these mean and why are they so engaged and what does it mean to them in terms of how they think and live. So it's always good to start those conversations and give the space for young people to start stepping forward. Back to the work environment, Gen Zers, in this study that was done, the Gen Zers felt the most challenging group to actually work for would be the 68% who said baby boomers. Baby boomers being the 58 to 76-year-olds. And the reason for that is they don't understand technology, they're resistant to change, they're old-fashioned, they're hierarchical and elitist. Now, again, these are not my words, but theirs. But this is an indication. You'll see across on the right-hand side, the Gen Z in the workplaces, one of the reasons, the challenges they feel is they're not being heard, they've been underestimated, they've been labelled or not being able to make or drive positive change. Now, these are the same challenges that we should expect that they'll be feeling in the school system because they are the same children or the same students of the same age group. So if they're feeling them as they enter into the workforce, they certainly will be feeling them across other parts. The one interesting thing for me on this particularly was the other group they wouldn't want to work for at 19% were other Gen Zers. So they recognise that they'd love to work for millennials, but not so keen on working for their peers. Another why are we here and what could we learn today is a very big trend that's happening right across the globe. So within a few years, there'll be 2 women to earn a degree for every 1 man across the world. And this is a significant trend everywhere I look. Every data point is saying the same thing. It's been this way in higher education for a long time. We certainly see it here. The rate of people who are studying at postgraduate level, certainly females outnumber men considerably. Even within our compulsory education system in 2020, so 64% of female school leavers achieved their requirements versus 39.9% of males. So you'll see there's a differential that's coming about even within the school system. And so we've got this increasing gap between how we're engaging with young men versus how we're engaging with young females. And this differential continues right across the education system into the workforce. So when we start to look here, so on this graph here, apologize, it's quite detailed. I put the 2 arrows. The little X in the bottom arrow is males participating in higher education in New Zealand. The top diamond is female participation, and the circle in between is the average. The other countries that have got coloured marks are other small advanced economies like New Zealand. And so you'll see there are places like Finland and Sweden and Israel and Ireland. So I put them as comparisons. So we're not overall participation is lower than all of those other countries, but higher than some of the other developing nations, very large populations. And you'll see here, though, the only countries where males outperform India, in Turkey, in Germany, there's one down here in Switzerland, and in Korea. So the rest of the world, females are dominating across the higher education market. And so the differential is quite profound, and you'll see that there's quite a percentage point difference. And so the children we're not engaging at school are not going on to do higher education either in this, from a gender perspective. And then one remarkable stat that came out this year in the US, and this is a Bloomberg stat that came out that for the first time, and it's been reported in many different media, that women became the majority of the workforce in the US. So for a long time, it hovered at around 40%, and it's increased over the last few years, and then it's up to 51% of the workforce now. But the big shift is managerial level roles are more dominated by women now than men. And so this is, again, shows that we have this global shift towards the system has a preference towards teaching females. And then when you look forward, and this, again, this stat and is talked about in many different ways. This one's from WSJ, which is that 15 job categories projected to grow the most in the next decade, all but 2 are primarily going to be occupied by women based upon current stats. And that's, of course, the aging workforce. So we're going to have a lot more people in care, and a lot more people supporting roles, a lot more people in the education system, more people in advice, and actually so nurturing type roles, which is typically in the domain of females. So we do have to think about our young men, about what do we engage them in and how do we make sure we don't lose them. And then just lastly on this report, the state of the global learning poverty, put out by a number of organisations in collaboration. And what's really interesting, in poor parts of India, English has been learnt faster than females than with men. And remarkably also now that 40% of private businesses in China are now owned by females. So you're seeing this female empowerment across education playing out into the workforce. And while it's obviously great to see more equity and having a lot more females coming through, it is to the detriment of not having such great success right across the board with male participation and achievement in education. Jumping back to the Reimagining Tamaki Makaurau report, the technologies are changing, the types of levers that we have to negotiate across the country, but across the world, should be fed through the education system. So how do we think about education when we've got accelerating technological change, hyperconnectivity, changing nature of work? This is the whole distributed work, the 4-day working week, much more flexibility, growing resource scarcity, climate change, environmental degradation, changing security, demographic change, risks in social cohesion, power and geostrategic relationships, going all the way through to changing governance systems. So these, if you think about a student in the same way that you might be concerned about the very same topics, students don't get to disconnect from these issues. They're on their social media, they're on their mobile phones, they're seeing these things playing out. And so how do we actually lean in and support students to navigate these big, very tricky and complex themes that are starting to play through in their lives? And so how do we make sure that when they're in the school system and going into the real world, that we can really focus on their wellness and their mental health as well, to make sure that this is not overwhelming and it's not sort of kept out of the education system, but embraced in a way that can help them negotiate and support their views through change. Won't go through all this report. It's another OECD report that's just come out about building the future of education. But it really does identify that this idea of the changing environment is having us all question to reimagine what is the purpose of education. And so what they're saying is digital technologies will not merely disrupt jobs and communities, but they're going to also enhance them. So we keep thinking negatively, but actually there's going to be a lot of people who have more enjoyable jobs, less physically demanding jobs, be able to have more flexibility, more kind of more rounded, more grounded ways of working. But we actually have to understand the differences between task and knowledge, and we have to be thinking about how do people meaningfully connect with social and civic life as well throughout the decades that they'll be on this planet. So there's plenty of literature out there, and certainly if there's any of these reports that you see you'd like to have a copy of, let me know and I'll get them out to you. There's just an abundance of people spending a lot of time and energy to try to understand where we're going around the purpose of education. Again, this is very detailed, but incredibly important, again, from OECD, taking this framework about how do we think about learning. So on the left-hand side, how do we approach learning to be more holistic and integrated, so it's more balanced, so that it doesn't sort of feel like it's not really thinking this whole integrated system. Education doesn't operate in a silo. It actually needs to be contextualized in the real world and the community, the society that the students live in. On the right-hand side, how do they access the full scope of societal outcomes of learning? And so, how do students understand that? What can they take from that? And then down the bottom here, make lifelong learning the guiding concept. And this is something that I've, for the last 25 years in education, I've been really pushing, is why do so few people keep learning and keep understanding how fast and much the world is changing, and keep embracing learning as part of their own confidence building and their own knowledge bank. And then, of course, there's this, in the Venn diagram here, there's the kind of the overlap between looking beyond formal education and understanding human learning, what it means, developing a new approach to equity and inclusiveness. And then at the heart of it is how do you provide advice on to provide cost efficiency in education and a focus on innovation. So that how do we make it so the cost efficiency is about access and equity, but also how do we make sure that innovation and creativity is one of the best ways of problem solving out of difficult situations. So some key indicators that are worth looking at. So if I look back to teachers within the New Zealand context, and you'll see here, I've highlighted New Zealand at the bottom. So what's interesting here, you'll see this is the actual number of teachers aged over 50 years of age. So you'll see in New Zealand highlighted, the primary school teachers are slightly younger, on average, just under 40. Then we have those in the secondary who are on average just over 40. And then we have a slightly older group within the tertiary sector, somewhere around the 50, maybe just under 50. But actually on a whole, our teaching workforce globally is getting older. And you'll see certainly in places across the board here, there's a lot of markets where over 40 or 50 is becoming the norm. And certainly we have the average age of a teacher in New Zealand is still 55. But when you normalise it across here, you'll start to see that there's a very narrow band, a lot of people in a small age group. The other thing we need to look at when how many people are enrolling in ITE or initial teacher education for the first time for the secondary school sector. And you'll see here that actually older people are not entering education at any higher rate. So less than 10% of people who are going into education are in that 45 years or over. So they typically are younger, but it's pretty choppy. And actually the under 25s in the last few years, you'll see between 2014 and really recently, it's been on a really big dive. So it hasn't been a desirable career for young people to go into. And so while in 2021 there was a little bit of a lift, I suspect that was probably a little bit to do with COVID, that people felt it was a safe career in terms of it was always going to be in demand. And maybe that will drop again, but we do need to understand that we're going to need to replace a lot of teachers in the next decade or two. This one here is in talking about salaries and what people are paid in education. And so these are, everything here has been normalized to US dollar amounts, and this is in 2020. And we see New Zealand highlighted, I've put the two red lines through the middle of those of the actual salaries of people who are salary teachers between 25 and 64 years old, and then the salary at the top of the scale. And you'll see they bump very, very closely together. The starting salary is the blue block. So if you compare us to other markets, you'll see that actually we have very, very little scope to promote teachers from where they start to where they can go from a salary band. And you'll see much higher variations in the differential in other markets, much more significant. And so, if we're thinking about the cost of living, thinking about what people get paid, this is going to be really tricky because they can actually go across. And if you go across to Australia on the left-hand side, just a few in from the left, you'll see they have the same situation with very little differences, but their starting salary is higher, but also overall the salaries are higher. So just by jumping across, but if you start to go to some other markets, you start to see much higher levels of at the top end of the scale. And so the UK is a great example of that, where that starts to increase dramatically. So all of these things come back to the types of people in teaching, the types of people who want to stay in teaching, but also what's the incentive that we put forward to getting great people into education. The other challenge we have here is our fees for education are reasonably high by comparison. So New Zealand is around the middle section there. So all of our bachelor's, short, master's and doctoral programs are all clumped pretty closely together in terms of the cost of study. And if you look to the right, there's a lot of our other small advanced nations, the Sweden, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Denmark, for example, with zero fees. So we have actually, while we've normalized this idea that everybody has to pay fees and tuition fees are a part of learning, actually they're quite expensive. And we're certainly at the higher end of the OECD. And so that also has an equity issue. And if you look at that, how it plays out right now, so last year there was nearly 150,000 students borrowed money for their students' loans and averaging around $10,000 a year. And the average balance of a typical student was $23,000, which is a huge amount of money to be going into the workforce with. And that's assuming that there will be some who have significantly higher than that, depending on what they studied. So this also impacts on the future of education. Going back to the global learning poverty update, just a couple of things. COVID has definitely had a huge impact on students. We have all got their concerns. If you're a parent or a teacher, really makes no difference. There's been a big gap in learning. And so some of the inequalities that have, through school closures, people are just starting to see what the impact might be going forward and of these COVID students. So you look here from UNESCO, UNICEF and the World Bank, they've done this great graph which shows the period of the grey band where schools were closed. And actually, you'll see that the little pink arrow is the drop of learning. So forgetting things that they learned but forgot because they were away from school for so long, or learning that was foregone because it never got caught up. And so the yellow line shows the learning trajectory of post-COVID. And so we've got this measurable potential future learning loss between children coming out of our school system today and our university system around the world, and the gap of where they would have been. So the blue line is the ideal line of what would we do if across the world we played catch up? What would that look like? So again, going to this report about the state of global education crisis, what would the path to recovery look like if we were to do that? What's been created is this rapid framework. And so if you look at it, they're saying what we need to do right now is reach every child and keep them in school for as long as possible. And so making sure we do everything possible globally to do that. Assess learning levels regularly, so have much closer looking at measurement of how students are achieving and how they're progressing. So really making sure that at a national level we understand. Prioritising teaching fundamentals, so that's the literacy, numeracy, social emotional skills, and actually focus instruction on closing gaps, and then increase the efficiency of instruction. catch-up learning. So this is going to be the hard one, because how do you catch up when you're already behind? So targeted instruction, structured pedagogy, tutoring, self-guided learning. This is where digital is really great. So you've got kids who need support. There are so many digital platforms now that can really extend learning. It can help with gifted students. It can help with catch-up students. But we need to understand that efficiency around instruction. And then we also need to focus on the psychosocial, the health and well-being of our students more than ever before. And so how do we do that? So this is a global report. So it talks about things like safety, nutrition, access to water, but these things are just as important for our students here, making sure they feel safe, that they have got access to good food, and actually that they feel, that they've got the ability to go into a space and to learn. So this is going to have a global impact, and we all can start to appreciate now this gap in learning is going to be quite difficult to catch up on. So I'm getting close to finishing, but I just wanted to talk about this this report that was commissioned by the Ministry of Education, written by Nolene Wright, on e-learning and implications for schools. And I thought this was a really interesting report because I'll just go through some of the insights of what was recommended. So the national context in this report, so this is verbatim. So it said, many young people are technologically literate. They regard they're regarding social networking. They use mobile technologies as everyday tools. They've got learning in e-rich environments, makes peer and collaborative learning opportunities easier. So it supports students' cognitive, affective and social interactions. It also appears to suit many New Zealand students, including Māori and Pacifica. So there's great evidence to show that actually e-learning is a great way of doing it. The prevalence of e-learning technologies as a natural way of working in technologically rich New Zealand schools point to ways which traditional learning can be achieved in highly motivating ways. So it has all this great stuff about what can be achieved through e-learning. And then in terms of pedagogy and e-learning, so it is the e-learning and collaborative co-constructed pedagogies appear to be linked, so you can put the two together and really make it strong. The dynamics of classroom change when e-learning is part of the regular environment is strong as well. It fosters interaction and cooperation, preventing access to schools with mobile technologies. So here it's saying if you don't give access, students will get access to information anyhow, and then they've got this gaming, virtual world of technologies and mobile phones, potentially have a lot to offer education. Now, this report, a great report, really spells out some of the benefits of what we could be embracing, knowing what we know about young people today. The frustrating piece for me as someone in my role is this report was commissioned 12 years ago. So 12 years on, we're talking about the same things. And actually, I think going into COVID, there was a lot of people who hadn't even really explored fully what e-learning would look like, and of course had to do it very quickly. And I take my hat off to people who had to figure that out remotely. But there is this disconnect between what we know to be true. We can see behaviours, we know demographic changes, we know the technologies of a time, but actually we haven't done enough fast enough. And it's really the responsibility, I think, of the entire community to start thinking about how do we really support our students through these times of change. So we'll go back to one of our avatar friends. I'll just play just a little quick outro here.
Thanks for staying here to listen in. I hope this has you thinking even a little bit about how I see the world and my role in it. I'm even hopeful that even a small part of you is curious enough to ask a few more questions and maybe even challenge the status quo. See you in the metaverse.
And then one of the things before I close up and we move to questions is I really do believe that the world doesn't get better by chance. We do need to get better by changing things, and we need to understand what change looks like so that as we go forward, that we can put together the best education system possible so that we're future fit for the generation who's coming through. And this is before we even get to the alphas who are going to hit us before. These are the up to 9-year-olds who are going to be or have started into our school system already, who are going to expect even more around flexibility. So let me just close off in terms of stopping sharing. Apologies, that was a lot taken at once. It's always strange talking to a blank screen. So I don't see the questions. So I obviously have a chance to see them now. So I'll pass back.
Okay, Frances. So I'm just going to go through the chat to begin with. So if anyone wants to add in any, then by all means do that. But what we will do is we'll open it up if people actually want to turn on their cameras and ask Frances directly. So our first question that has come through was quite early on from Leanne. Francis, do you think there is a connection between decreasing attendance and pedagogical approaches being implemented?
Absolutely. Look, I think that and I think it shows again with boys more than girls. And if you're teaching boys or you've got sons who are boys, what we could say that the kind of stickiness of computer games, the gamification, the instant reward and gratification that comes with computer games is really changing the way they think about learning. And of course, it's a very big disconnect between that world and the world of learning. Young girls don't play as much computer games, and I think that they're sort of having the disconnect is not quite so big. But I think we need to be thinking more around what does gamification look like inside a classroom? What does it look like where learning is rewarded in different ways? It's not about passing the assessment to achieve the confidence that you're doing something well. I think we need to reward success in very different ways. So it's not about passing, retaining, or retention of knowledge, but actually contribution, about collaboration. It's about creativity. And so I think if we start to think about, we live with a generation who like to be told how they're doing much more often than perhaps we liked when we were young, that we just need to understand that the expectations are different because the outside influences are just so much more kind of engaging than what we can possibly do in a classroom as it stands today.
Thank you. Next one, again, this was quite early on when you were talking about the move into micro-credentials. So are the micro-credentials moderated for learning outcomes?
Yes, they are. So New Zealand is really lucky. So all micro-credentials are on the framework with NZQA. So they're quality assured in the same way that any qualifications are. So, so for example, in our case, all but one of our micro-credentials are level 8 or level 9. So they are built and quality assured and they're really robust. If you go, for example, into Australia, they're not. So micro-credentials can be taught by anyone. There's no framework, there's no quality assurance or alignment, but they're going through that process now because they realized it created a huge amounts of uncertainty for employers about how good one micro-credential was versus another one. And so we're taking more of the global theme, thanks to NZQA, that we're actually putting it together so that they are credits you earn and they are rewards that you can add together. And we have a stackable micro-credential system so you can build your micro-credentials together, which is also wonderful.
Great, thank you. And we did answer this one, but I just want to raise it with you anyway. So within New Zealand, our future generation is Māori. How do you see these statistics influencing education in New Zealand?
So the most important one is if we take a Māori first view of education, we will all become better for it. I mean, we've got to have a far greater understanding culturally of the differences between the way the teaching system is right now and how it doesn't support Māori and to a certain extent Pacifica as well, with the style of learning and the collaboration that goes on. You're almost taking a cultural perspective and removing it when you go into a classroom because so much is done in isolation and so much is about the individual. But there's a lot more, and there are experts on this who are far more knowledgeable than I am, who really understand the benefits. But we do have to, obviously, first and foremost, we have to get equity back into schools so that everybody has a chance to get great teachers, great access to subjects, and role models about where they can go. We really need to make sure that we are painting the path and we have a North Star for everybody, every young student in this country to be who they want to be. But at the moment, there's just not the equity at the beginning. It's at the very beginning of education, it starts to separate. And so as the population demographics change, we'll get caught out if we don't suddenly realise that achievement is going to be so important to get right now. Achievement in its broader sense, I don't mean in assessments, I'm talking about achievement as the individual feeling that they've had a system that supported them to be the best they possibly could be.
Great, thank you. We had a question from LinkedIn that came from Carrie. So how do you see education delivery changes impacting teaching methodologies, i.e. standardized testing versus mastery-based learning? How are we going to know students are mastering a concept?
Look, it's an interesting question because, when you hire someone, how do you know they've mastered a concept anyhow? I mean, we have a validation of a reward, a certificate, but actually we take it on board that we have to figure out whether someone has mastered it, and then of course their careers progress based upon what they have learned or what they experience. I think we have to move away from this idea that there is a measurement that can tell someone how successful they are going to be, and that all 12-year-olds are going to have the same level of understanding, and therefore they should be assessed and valued in the same way. everybody learns at a different rate. Everybody has different concepts around what they want to learn, what success looks like. So I think when you come back to mastery, a lot of mastery is what people do, or not necessarily what they've passed. And so I think part of it is employers will start to say, actually, we're not looking for a particular piece of paper, we're looking for a particular type of person, because they're flexible, they learn well, they collaborate with others, they're willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and be curious. And they'll say, well, that's the mastery we want. It's not about, did you pass, your NCEA? Now, and that will take time, because some employees default back to systems to give them the validation. But actually, in today's job market, I have to say it's quite delightful, because there are so many jobs, and we've got the highest employment of young people we've ever had, that actually people can bypass that system if they choose to, improve their own worth and validation of what they can do and their abilities in the workplace without having necessarily to go through that traditional system.
Great,
big topic.
You.
Love the passion, Rowena.
Yeah, I can see the arms going up. So the next one, how do you see the skills clusters being used and businesses reaffirming again the role of micro-credentials, capabilities, etc., not just academic achievement, moving to momentum?
Fantastic. Thanks, Cheryl. And I think this is quite similar to the last question in some ways. Micro-credentials right now are definitely flavour of the month globally. They've been very heavily pushed within the country here. Employers still don't really have a good understanding of what they are. I think it's just at the moment the story hasn't been told enough. We haven't really said the story about what is a micro-credential, what gap does it fill. What I think we'll know within a few years, and employees will understand, it is the building blocks it's the bridge between what people know and to show that they've been on this journey of learning over time, because every part of our workplace is changing. So the other part is that people are working in much more multidisciplinary roles. So if you're a marketing person today, you might work for a building company, but your next marketing role might be sitting within a logistics company, and then you're moving off into an engineering firm. So you're having to do these bridging all the time, because you have to become a subject specialist in a short time. You're not going to go back and do another degree. You're not going to go and spend hours and hours in your own time trying to decipher what the sector's about. So small bite-sized learning that's bridge knowledge gaps, but also build the bridge to the next step in knowledge. I think people will start to understand very quickly the benefits of this kind of incremental staircasing of knowledge on top of each other, and less about the big long qualification and as a measure of academic success. I've hired and seen thousands of students who have actually not non-completed degrees, who are absolutely brilliant, because actually something better came along in the last ended part of their studies and they took the job, and it should never be held against them. So I think it's in real life, we don't put all those measures heavily on people, but we talk about them as though they're the beginning and end of all success. But I very seldomly see it play out that way in the job market. Most people are just looking for highly capable, good people to be around. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Michael from Facebook has asked, in terms of learning loss, what about the skills they have learned throughout the pandemic? This assumes we should do it like we did before.
Oh, Michael, I like your question. That's awesome. So I think this is they've learned so much. I mean, talk about learning resilience, collaboration, talking about new tools and skills and self-learning and discovery and curiosity, and also, even those skills of being at home. And how many of us learned, I'm looking at you, Claire, with your roller skating, who have learned, new skill. Oh, she's got them on. You got to love a principal who's got her roller skates on. So, the skills that you learn when you're in lockdown, because you've got more time, we all learn new skills. We all learn more about ourselves. And actually, I think the value of that is actually amazing if we don't keep going back to it's about passing the exam, because actually the gap of knowledge there is going to be quite profound. I'm sure we're going to see some metrics when going to look on the wrong side of the ledger in the next few years. But if we go back the other way and start talking about what's really valuable about what we've learned, I think we'll find we've discovered a lot about young people who are far more resilient and far more capable, and probably very entrepreneurial because of what they've been through. And I think a lot of us are starting to discover that about ourselves as adults, that we're starting to know that we can do more than we thought we could ever do, because we're put through a time of great change.
And the next question is from Claire, the roller skating principal. What do you see as MOE's role in closing the digital divide?
Look, I think government as a whole is tricky, because they are there for the people. And they, we need to put pressure on government agencies and politicians if we want change, because then their job is to reflect the majority. And I think that too often we think it's the job of agencies to make the change, but if no one's asking them, if no one in large numbers is pushing change, they are risk adverse as groups. They're using taxpayer money, so particularly adverse to spending money and taking risk. And education and probably health are the two sectors where they're going to be the most concerned of getting it wrong. And so I think it's only through the amplification of voices and concern and others willing to get together and take messages together to the Ministry of Education saying, it's not working, we've got ideas. How could we take this idea? This is why we believe it will work. These are the people who will back it. These are the students and the families who would support it. And actually start giving permission for them to take more risk. Because in the absence of taking risk and no one saying anything, you do the same again and again. And I don't blame anyone in government or politics for doing that, because that's how they got there. That's how they got their role. And actually, it's a bit like the private sector. We can move fast and we can do things really quickly because we're not, the compliance is much more reduced, and there's also many workarounds. But the majority of people in this country, the number one employer is the government. And so as a country, we are risk adverse because we have these huge constraints. I think right now, all governments in the world are probably looking for good ideas, because the same issues that we're facing in education here are the same issues that have been faced across the world. And so it's about how do we give permission and say we're prepared to take a few risks with our generation of children who are coming through the system, because we think doing more of the same is riskier than doing something different.
Now we have another one from Michael from Facebook. What are the potential advantages for incorporating Te Ao Māori into our New Zealand curriculum to give an edge?
Another great question. Look, I think Te Ao Māori is our definitely a piece of magic for us as a country. That there is so much we can learn. I think by bringing it into the school curriculum, we'll start to understand our identity. We'll start to understand our belief system. We'll start to understand the philosophy of how we think and why is it we are who we are. And I'm talking as a collective. There are so many things uniquely and distinctly that you have to come from Aotearoa to experience. But I think most importantly, this idea that we think about long-term benefit, we think about the past for the future, and actually understanding we're making decisions today that are going to be massively impactful on future generations. It's our responsibility to be brave and to make those decisions, form the knowledge system and the collective of people who can contribute, bring in youth, bring in elders, bring in people with experience, and find commonality and go together as a united force of change. And I think if we go back to Te Ao Māori, I think we'll understand it. We'll understand so much more about who we are, but also who we could be. And I think right now we don't need to be like anyone else. We've got so much we can be in our own identity. And I'm super excited about where we're heading. But I think a lot of that's going to come with Te Ao Māori and the curriculum, and actually taking away some of all that misnomers and the mistakes that we didn't, in the past, and things we didn't understand and things we did wrong, and actually really to build that capability.
Thank you. So we've got one here about ITE from Leanne. So to be successful in shifting the methods of delivery and purpose of education, the ITEs will need to adjust their curriculum and training to reflect this, wouldn't they? Do you see this happening?
Yes, they absolutely need to change. And like, I think, there's all sorts of numbers that thrown around about the number of, for example, how many hours of science training you get as a teacher in a primary school. You might be lucky to get 10 hours in total across your IT experience, and yet we know science is a big part of the future curriculum. There's the model at the moment, I think it would say it doesn't have enough flexibility for different types of learning environments. It's not enough, there's not enough practicums involved, there's not enough work experience, there's not enough about being able to fit the system of learning into the school community that the teachers plan to work in, because every school is different. But fundamentally, we do definitely need to be teaching different subjects. There is a range of subjects right now with all the flexibility that NCEA has, but we don't necessarily teach people how to teach differently. And so if you go back to what you learned when you were at school yourself, it's easy to fall back into the same ways, same teaching methodologies used that you were taught by. So I think part of, for me, it's the subject knowledge, but even more so, more important is actually talking about how to teach. How do you teach in this world where there's hybrid learning, where you've got, very diverse kids doing things? And of course, we now know that not all children learn the same way. And in fact, they learn in multiple different ways. And so how does a teacher do that when you've got a really mixed group of neurodiverse kids with different skills and gifts in the same classroom? So a lot more focus on that, I think, would be really powerful.
Great. And Lisa from Facebook, what are your thoughts on a more project-based and applied learning context to embed knowledge and skills, or is it all about digital space?
So I'll work that question backwards. Digital is just a space or a tool. It's nothing more than that. So there's, you should never teach digital for digital's sake. It's, kids, it's their tool of the time. Mine happened to be a typewriter and a pen. I don't use them anymore very often, occasionally a pen, but actually I think it is about context. So project-based and applied learning for me is the only type of learning. It's the stuff you remember. It's the stuff that 20 years on, you can still kind of feel, sense, tell you about who you were in the partnership with, what was your teacher, the things that you did. How many people can still remember their projects they made at woodwork, or and the scones they made in home economics, or the ashtray that they made in metalwork? We remember those things because we made them. They were projects. We got to do them. They were tactile. They were so different from the classroom that we sat and just listened. There's a reason we remember, all these years on, because actually it's engaging. It changes the whole neurons in our brain, the way we think about it. So the more we can do project-based learning, the more we can do practical applied learning, the better it's going to be for everyone, because everybody learns better that way.
See Lisa's arms are going up too. So from Vincent, we have got the technological platforms now on offer provide huge potential, but also contain risks on disinformation and reinforcing existing negative biases. Has any work been done on how to support children to learn to filter information and challenge negative stereotypes and behaviours, particularly in virtual environments?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because I think most adults don't even know how to use the internet properly. I think the majority of adults have never been taught. They go to Google, they put a word in, and they hope that what they get served back up is reliable and it's accurate. But actually their algorithms, of course, it could dominate everything you see, depending on what you've looked at. And even the most simplest things like using the incognito mode in Chrome, which is, making sure that all your previous searches do not influence what you see. Most adults don't know that. We had a conversation just on yesterday here, and I said, how many people use the I'm feeling lucky button on Google? And most are like, oh, I've never used that. Don't even know what it's for. Or the scholar tab, or, actually looking at some of the things, or reverse image search so you can understand where things come from, or Google Earth so that you understand, you can go into a place and discover a city from an environment. Most people don't understand what the internet does. And so we get caught in a rabbit hole of the most popular apps and things that and of course then becomes a belief in ethical system of how much of this do you believe and how much of this do you take on as being gospel for the truth. So I think everybody needs to understand that there is massive risk on the internet. There is huge amounts of fake information, and actually it is not like going to the library where most things have been selected based upon a certain filter of criteria of quality. That we need to be able to understand all the biases that are in biases, but also all of the algorithms that are taking us down some really strange pathways. So ethics, sort of the effectiveness of information, the credibility of data, all of those things need to be taught, and they probably need to be taught at a family level and a community level, not just for our kids, because actually some of the biggest mistakes I see and some of the assumptions that people make are just as much from adults as they are from young people who are sort of in some ways a little more savvy to some of these things. The good thing about virtual environments is you're actually talking. You have to be pretty much who you are. Like if you've got kids who play computer games or esports and they've got the headphones on, they're talking to each other. And so there's an element of they're not as anonymous as somebody who is trolling on social media, who you no idea they are. They're not speaking. You don't even know what gender they are. They could be anyone. There's an element, I think, of younger people who are a little more switched on and a little more prepared to kick people out of environments that they feel like something's not right than actually we are. We're quite trusting. We have much more open Facebook accounts. We leave open Instagram accounts. We do all sorts of weird things as adults, assuming that everybody's just nice like us. But actually, I'd love to see people understand what the internet is really for and how it can be used for education, because there are so many amazing tools that we just don't see, far beyond YouTubing and actually trying to find your answer that way. Yeah.
Okay, next one. With the growing average age of teachers, what are some directions that employers or the Ministry of Education should be exploring to promote and attract more younger people into the profession?
Look, it's a very competitive market right now. I think the cost of living is going up, inflation's going up, and salaries are not. It's going to be really hard to attract people into education. I think just purely on the basis, it's not a great paying career. It's a really hard, complex career, and you've got so many aspects which are far more than knowledge and sharing and education. And so I think we need to reward teachers in a very different way. I think if you look at the systems where education is valued and teachers are put on pedestals, the education systems are much more successful. And the Finnish model is a great example of that, where they are literally rewarded as being sort of, it's not so much just financial reward, it's the accolades and the kind of the prestige that a teacher has. I think we've gone away from that. And so Finland don't actually pay the most, but they have huge prestige about becoming a teacher and staying as a teacher. So I think there's things that we can do, and I think we've gone away from that. We don't see how hard teachers work, and I think a lot of teachers have absolutely underappreciated just how complex their jobs are. So for me, that would be a really big one, is how do we give it prestige again and actually let people know that teachers are at the backbone of society. They're the strength of our kids and our future. They're the aspirations of many, and a good teacher can change a life in a nanosecond for one person and change a whole community. So all of that should be celebrated. Hey, Fia, I just realised we just missed one around, just a very quick one here. Just talking about, wouldn't it be great if the digital learning, including holograms, could be the norm for tertiary education providers? And I just want to acknowledge that, I think
apologies.
It's okay, but I just think, we do have, there's a lot of tech right now, I think, which we should be exploring. I think we could be a bit of an incubator for using fun things, not as part of the curriculum, but actually having places in the community where you could go and explore and test new tech, because there's really great tech out there. But of course, accessibility is still at the moment for the privileged. So, if we can find ways of accessing the cool new tech, I think that would be really great. So I think good point, Sho.
Okay, direct one here. Are you happy with the NCEA review? Is it going in the right direction?
Paul, I can't actually answer that because I don't know intimately enough to really comment. I typically rely on other good people out there to tell me what they think, and I just think the jury's still out on that one right now, so I probably will pass on that one. I'm just not familiar enough with it.
Okay, and one from Rowena. What do you think about the role of the teacher being a facilitator rather than the teacher of content? If so, shouldn't teachers' training programs need to change and become more about social, impactful development for the learner? What's good for Māori is good for all. I love that phrase, Māori first view of education. Wow.
100%. Yeah, look, I think even though the term facilitator is a term I know a lot of teachers don't like, I think the function as a facilitator actually makes total sense. And I know that from years of teaching that if you look at the knowledge within the room and you turn it around so everybody is basically able to contribute to the conversation with all their expertise, you get a much richer experience. And one of the things, I'll use the example, if you were teaching a class of year 8 students and you were talking about the solar system, if you looked across the class and said, let's just start by saying, what does everybody in the class know about the solar system? So you capture on a shared document all the things people know, from satellites to different planets to space travel to SpaceX to UFOs, everything possible that people talk about, capture it all, and then decide which of these things are most interesting to you as an individual. And they decide, and then they find groups who are interested in that. And then as groups, they self-select, they find the areas that they're interested in, they work through the way they want to do that project. Now, they could present that back as something physical. It could be something that they share back as a poem. There could be some written work. It could be whatever. It might be a song, who knows? But everybody's got a different learning outcome, but they're all sharing that learning back as a classroom. So that actually in that class, everybody has learned from each other, not just everybody doing the same thing. And I think this idea that everybody learns the same thing at the same time is such a lost opportunity for everyone to actually learn different things and actually share it back. But also, what about the kid in that class whose dad works at the observatory, or the one who's been a member of of some kind of interesting, I don't know, science group since they were young, the gifted child who's got a really deep knowledge who could share back. So I think the idea of facilitation for me works if you share that with the whole class, saying anyone could be a facilitator if they want to start sharing their knowledge back into the classroom. And I think as you get older, you get better at understanding that. But I think even young children are amazing how often they've got deep knowledge because of their own passion areas. And the books, you can go into any child's bedroom and see what they're into by the books that they collect or the things that they watch. And so allowing that knowledge to come through, I think, is also really important. So.
And I think we've got one final question before we loop back, and that is, any comment on how changes to the decile system could improve our education system?
Look, I think I've never understood the system in the beginning. So I think any improvement in terms of not sort of, again, when we label people with a decile, we're labeling them for life. But this idea that one school has a different rating to another school, I sort of feel like we've got to get beyond this idea that there is a judgment across groups or there is a label. And so I think we're in a world now, labels are, we're moving into this non-binary world, and it's not about black and white. It's just, we are who we are, and we live where we choose to live, or we choose, or we our family's our family. It's not about having this kind of idea of identity defined by an external force. So I think just removing it is a big step in the right direction.
Yes. Now I'm just going to share back my slides.
Now, apologies, there's a lot of talking, and
and I just really thank you thank you very much to everybody for those incredible questions. I think it's really valuable that we have that half an hour for people to really unpack the insights from Frances and then to put it into context of the questions that are on their mind. So thank you. So we've got 3 minutes before we end, and we will close with a karakia to close this session. But just 2 last slides. If anything of what you've heard and seen today has got you excited about learning in the education space, then obviously the Mind Lab has 3 programs. You may or may not know about them. So we've got our little micro credential. So that's level 8, 15 credits, digital and collaborative teaching and learning, gets you back into learning, gives you a great taster, and of course it's definitely all about your practice. Likewise, our postgraduate certificate in digital and collaborative learning, level 8 again, but a lot longer. So you're looking at 37 weeks, and that's 60 credits. And so thinking about even the next part of that, Master of Contemporary Education, that postgrad is a third of the way towards your Masters. And so obviously the Masters is level 9, 180 credits. And it's all about you and your context and being able to create a project that is tangible to you, and so that you can walk away feeling like you've got something that can be implemented. And of course, the wonderful Lisa Whittington-Slater, who is with us this evening, I've just put up on screen her contact details. She is our outreach manager. As I said before, an incredibly empathetic person who is here to answer questions, to listen to your challenges, and to take you on a learning journey if that's what you're ready to do with us, whether it's a micro-credential, postgrad, or indeed your Masters. So I will just close us off with a final karakia. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia watia a te ara, kia turaki whakataai, kia turaki whakataai, homie, huie, tai kia. Kia ora everyone, thank you for being generous with your time this evening. I hope you've got some great insight from tonight.